So welcome to the Speakblackman conference, our first conference. Today we are so honored to have an incredible guest with us. She is Dr. Noreen, and she did her studies on their doctoral research on young Black men accessing psychological support. This is something that I'm extremely fascinated about, and when I found her on social media, I became addicted to her work, and that's why she's here today because I'm so passionate about what she's doing. And I think by us having this event for the first time, it's so important to start with actual research that will guide what we're doing to support you as Black men to become your best. Ultimately, what we're doing here is to prepare you to be the best you can be in a challenging world with so much discrimination, so much things. We want to achieve upward mobility. And today, I'm so honored to have Noreen with me. So at this time, I'm just going to give her a chance to tell us a bit more about herself and what she do.
Thank you so much, Ontonio, for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to be part of this conference, but also to be here today to share a little bit about my work. So as you've introduced me, my name is Dr. Noreen Dera, and I'm a clinical psychologist, but also I work as a clinical lecturer supporting apprenticeship programs in clinical psychology. And currently I am working within the Integrated Gangs Unit, which supports young adults who are affected by gang life. And the majority of my clients are young Black men. What I was doing prior to my doctorate, I was working in sort of diverse borough in London, and I was supporting young Black men to access psychological therapies. So it almost feels quite momentous to be here because it feels like all facets of my identity, my passions, my interest are coming together, and it's such a pleasure to speak to you today and share a bit about my research story, but also the fascinating findings that I managed to glean from this research.
Wow, I just love your passion and all the experience you've garnered over the years. You're definitely a part of the Speakblackman family right now. So welcome home. All right. So my first question is, I have a few questions for you today that will really give us some more insight into to my difficult we have as Black men and accessing psychological support. My first question is, I want to understand more about what inspired your research. Why did you choose to research young Black men?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I do like to kind of give people a bit of context because it really it's an opportunity for you to come on a bit of a journey with me of how this research started. And it started prior to my doctoral project. I started my doctorate in 2018, but prior to doing the doctorate, I was working in a very diverse London borough in what we call a primary care service. So primary care essentially means the first point of contact for people experiencing common mental health difficulties. And it's essentially free psychological. What was really interesting in my time in that service is that I had never seen a single Black man within my therapeutic practice. I had over 300 people that I interacted with within that 3-year tenure. And I noticed that there was such a discrepancy. And the discrepancy was not hard to miss because just within a 3-mile radius of the service that I worked at, there was an inpatient unit. And that inpatient unit housed all Black men. So 16 out of the 16 people who were on that ward were young Black men. And that's when I started to ask questions about the discrepancies within the service that I was working at. It was very clear that there was a need in the community, but a lot of the young Black men were being seen when they were in a state of crisis rather than in the preliminary stages of their distress. So I set out on a trail to ask important questions within my service, essentially for the service to hold the mirror up to themselves and think about what part they're playing in putting young Black men at a disservice, what initiatives they have in place to reach out to young Black men, knowing the kind of disparity in the access to care that they had. So at the time, the service almost commissioned me as an internal practitioner to conduct an audit. It was very clear that young Black men when they accessed the service, they were unlikely to be offered therapy. And also they were less likely to complete it. And even when they did complete it, their outcomes were pretty much abysmal. They did not really gain the benefits from therapy as we would hope for every single person. And for me, that was the point where I thought, actually, I have this little power as a practitioner. I might not be able to change the system, but I can try and think about initiatives to help us change the way in which we make the service accessible. And that's when I started looking into doing outreach programs into the community. I felt research would be a powerful conduit for me to continue that work. And I'm so grateful today to be here to share that I completed the project. It was a success. I recruited 13 young Black men who signed up to talk about their experiences of entering therapy, engaging in therapy, and completing therapy, which is a narrative that is not known or spoken about. So I think for me, it's been a journey of loads of pain, I'll be honest, because knowing the disparities and discrimination Black men face, it's no easy experience to have as a researcher, but there also has been victory at the end of it, because I'm here today to talk about what I found from the men who actually engage. And that's a story that is not told. And it's a story that needs to be centered, and a story that needs to be, I guess, valued, because it will help transform the way that we think about young Black men's relationship to help.
That's such a fascinating journey you just took us on. And I can relate to so much that you've said. I've been a therapist since 2017, and I can count on two hands, less than two hands, the amount of Black men I've seen working in a diverse borough. And that's the same thing that kind of, sparked this interest to really reach Black men more, because you can't be in a bar that is considered diverse, or an area that is considered diverse, and you're not serving the community.
Absolutely.
Because are not there, it's not a reflection of the community. But why I'm so interested in your research is to think about what are some of your findings.
Yeah, so as I said earlier, my research involved interviewing 13 young Black men. So I interviewed them all over Zoom platform, which was a really helpful way to kind of increase access to young Black men, because we know there's a lot of stigma around even participating in research. So I wanted to ensure that this research was conducted in a safe space for them, and interviewed 13 of them. And from those findings, what I did was to use a method called thematic analysis. And what this method allows them to do is to look at the narratives that were shared, and look for common themes or patterns in the research. I managed to find 4 major themes in the findings. So the first theme was around young Black men spoke about kind of the difficulties and the struggle they experience in actually admitting that they had a psychological difficulty. And this was for many reasons. Firstly, there was this societal expectation for them to be strong at all times, to be the provider of the family, but also lacking those kind of constructive role models, especially male role models who perhaps demonstrated vulnerability. A lot of them spoke about how they had to kind of live up to this societal expectation of being strong, but they also didn't have any positive representations of what it meant to be emotionally vulnerable. But they were also within systems where there was a lot of stigma around talking about mental health difficulties. And within the family unit, they spoke about how often there's this narrative of what happens at home stays at home. Yes. But within the home, they didn't feel equipped to actually deal with these issues. So there's almost this kind of dilemma of, I'm not being taught how to deal with my emotions, but at the same time, I'm not sort of encouraged to seek help outside, because actually that would be stepping outside the boundaries of what's expected of you. So they spoke about this struggle in navigating their identity, their culture, male expectations, but also this additional layer of having a mental health difficulty, which is almost like a triple stigma. So being Black, being male, and having a mental health difficulties. I mean, if we think about those 3 things coming together, it makes sense why a lot of the men spoke about their reluctance to speak up, because actually what they said was, by demonstrating that kind of vulnerability, they felt that they would be perceived as weak. They would be perceived as not being man enough, but they also felt that they'll be rejected by their peers. So for me, it was really interesting to think about the role of what even comes before the point of accessing services. These men were having to navigate so many social, cultural, political, economical barriers. So for them to actually go and knock on the door of a therapist really means that it's no easy process, you know? So that was one of the themes. And I think the four main barriers were shame, secrecy, stigma, and societal expectations. The four S's came up as the main themes that were barriers to seeking help.
Okay, brilliant. I think if you really clarify a lot of things that would make sense to what we are trying to do as a Speak Black Man movement, because we understand that the services are already there to support people who are in the UK. We got people who are coming in from different parts of the world, but if you're living in the UK, we know that there's a system. But my desire is to really get us out of the culture, the stigma, and all the societal things that we've been socialized. And this need to always be strong, as you mentioned, one of your findings, and that we're not emotionally vulnerable to really put ourselves in a situation that will make us better. And so what you're saying is really what I want to drive out there today, that the most important thing is really dealing with some of the beliefs that we have garnered throughout our entire life that is now becoming the hindrance to our success as Black men. Findings, I like the S's, and you need to tell us again the stigma. Tell us the S's again.
Yeah, so the four S's that came up were shame, sort of that idea of admitting that you needed help and how people might perceive you differently. Secrecy, so there was this thing about keeping things within the family home, because culturally and historically makes sense for us to be quite guarded with what we share, because that was needed for our survival as a community. There was societal expectation, this idea of what it means to be a Black man in society, and this expectation to be always strong, to always provide, and to always, you know, have everything together. And actually that's quite an unsustainable expectation to place on any person. And then the last one was stigma, which we know is commonplace in society anyway. We know that we've not made much progress in breaking down the stigma around mental health difficulties. So these four S's combined together, I think, are important for us to think about what might come in the way. And for each person, when you are at a place of asking for help, it's important to think which S is operating for you right now. You know, what is that thing that is acting as a barrier? Is it the stigma? Is it the shame? Is it the sense of secrecy? Is it the societal expectations that are unrealistic, by the way, that are being placed on you, that you need to dismantle? And I think by doing that inner work, we can start to move into a position of actually, I count and I matter. And actually this position that I am trying to sustain is not for me, it's working against me. And we know that the consequences of not accessing help early are very dire for Black men. As I said at the beginning of this presentation, young Black men are at higher risk of being sectioned. And when they are sectioned, they're less likely to recover because they are on physical treatments, and they're also more likely to have coercive treatment used against them. But actually, there's a lot that therapy can do to act as a preventative measure. And that will only be effective if we access help the minute we notice that there is an imbalance or a difficulty. Speaking up early means that we can access the help early, and actually that can have a generational effect as well in terms of those who come after that. We have role models to draw from, which is what the young men said. They said they didn't know any family member who'd gone to therapy, and perhaps you could be that person that can break that chain.
Question is, now that we've told them some of the barriers, how will psychological therapists help you as a Black man? What would you say to these young men here today? How would psychological therapy help them? How can it change your life?
Yeah, I think one of the key things that came up in the research was how people did not have a very realistic outlook or perception of therapy. Because when we think about how therapy is conveyed in the media or how it's conveyed in television programs, it doesn't actually give a true sense of what therapy is about. People feel that it's a space where you have to just lie down on a couch and talk to someone about your childhood experiences, but that could be nothing further from the truth. Therapy is actually a space for you to, firstly, like I said, show up and tell yourself that you count and that your experiences matter. And therapy is a space to unpack your life experiences, to think about some of the reactions that you have to different situations, some of the beliefs that you hold that maybe served you when you were growing up or when you were trying to survive through difficult times. Therapy can help you to understand and normalize that the responses that you had to those situations were functional. They made sense in the context of what you've experienced, but actually it's time for us to think about a way that we can move forward in a different way. Yeah. In a way that helps us to firstly look after our well-being, but also to change any patterns that are unhelpful, are maintaining certain difficulties. And I also want to highlight that a lot of the people who were in my study went to therapy for all sorts of reasons. Because I think there's this misconception that you go to therapy when you are in the depths of depression, when things are really bad. There were people in therapy for work-related stress. There were people in therapy because they couldn't sleep. There were people in therapy because they were struggling with academic pressure and work pressure. There were people in therapy because they'd lost a loved one. So what I want to illustrate here is that therapy isn't just for one thing that we think it's for. We can go to therapy for any reason, and that could be as small as, actually, I want to just know myself better. Yes. And that's it. That could be the starting point. And the therapist does the work of supporting you to get to a place where you can understand yourself better. And there's no need for you to know all the answers either.
Brilliant. That's such a lovely, lovely, lovely take there. I really appreciate that. Now, one thing we must recognize as Black men is that, listen, our greatest investment is in our mental wealth.
Yeah.
And I call it mental wealth because the more you invest in your mind and your state of mind is the more wealthy you become, physically, emotionally, all the alleys. All right. My final question is, now, what advice would you leave? I mean, you've done such a wonderful study that I'm sure it's going to make so much impact, not only in the UK, but globally. I'm getting a bit spiritual now.
I take that. I claim it.
But what advice would you give to these young men today who are, or these Black men today who decided to show up at this conference with a desire to know more about mental health and to know more about how to become their best self?
I think the first thing that I would say is that the fact that you signed up for this conference and you chose to be here today is a sign of that willingness that you have to begin to understand either yourself, what's come before you, but also where you're going. And I think that's a helpful starting point. The advice that I would give you is that this journey is non-linear. Right? So you might come to a place where you feel like, actually, I'm ready to explore or go to therapy, but you might also wake up the next morning and think, I'm not ready to face these struggles. And that is absolutely normal. We are learning and unlearning always. There are a lot of patterns, as I said before, that we have used for years and years, whether it's denying ourselves of support, whether it's believing that we're not worthy of psychological therapy, because for years, these are not channels that were available to us. And we've had to be quite resourceful and find our ways of coping. But unfortunately, those ways of coping do not serve us anymore. And we need to think about using what's out there, what's available to us to ensure that we get that help early. So I just want to encourage you today and just say, if you're in the early stages where you're still quite overwhelmed and not so sure what therapy will entail, speak to someone who knows the work, speak to someone who's been through the process, reach out to Ontonio and crew because they're doing this work and they're very passionate about it. And speak to people you trust first and foremost, because everyone is at different stages. And you might find that people have, maybe discouraging attitudes to therapy, but that's just one narrative. The narrative I have to tell you is that 13 young men who took part in this project found it helpful, found it powerful. And just to end with a quote that somebody mentioned in the study was, therapy was an achievement for me. My future self will forever thank me for it. And I hope that you can come to that place yourself as well.
Wow, that is the most beautiful statement to finish this amazing interview with Dr. Noreen. Dr. Noreen, we are so honored here at the Speakblackman Movement to have you. And listen, we'll definitely be calling upon you again in the future to share more of your findings and your research with us. Thank you so much for all the time you've invested into your project so we can be benefiting from it today. We know that you are busy. You're a doctor. You know you have things to do.
Yeah, I'm a busy woman.
We're gonna let you go.
But yeah.
Thank you so much from the Speak Blackman movement, and all the best in your future endeavors. How can we connect with you? Final thing, how can they connect with you?
You can follow me on my Twitter page, which documents the research that I've done, and that's Dr_N Dera. Hopefully, Antonio, you can share these details, and also you can email me. Hopefully, again, you can share the details. Please do get in touch. You've got that up. Please do get the details up. But if you want to follow real time on my research and the developments, because I'm hoping this is an ongoing process, please do follow my Twitter page as the first point of contact. You can also message me directly on there as well, and I'll be sure to respond as best as I can.
Brilliant. Thank you guys so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Noreen, for such a wonderful insight into your research and all your passion for us as Black men. Do enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much, Antonio. Bye-bye.